Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming. My name is Geeling Chau, and today I'll be sharing with you some of our experiences in scaling models for intracranial EEG data. This type of data is recorded from within the brain. As you can see in this brain picture, we have electrodes inside the brain, which give you high resolution EEG signals, which are basically averages of neural activity around the electrode. The project is titled Population Transformer, Learning Population Level Representations of Neural Activity. And we call it this because we're really focused on sort of modeling populations of electrodes. This may be a little bit different from what you're used to with populations of neurons being sort of the typical usage of the word population, but we're kind of using it as a more general sort of term here for just like groups and ensembles of, say, input channels. So that's what we're going to be looking at today. This work was done in close collaboration with Christopher Wong at MIT, as well as great collaborators at both Caltech and MIT. All right, so for this project, we're also motivated by this fundamental question that a lot of us at COSYNE are very interested in, and that is how can we better understand and decode the brain? To the whole conversation that we've been having at this Foundation Models workshop, I'd like to bring up just one thing about model expressivity and sort of the trade-offs there. A lot of the techniques that we're using today to try to understand these high-resolution temporal signals is that we would manually extract some features from this type of data that we collect. And then after we do that, we maybe use some small model, maybe a linear model or statistical analysis of these features in order to make some conclusion and understand something about the brain. And this is great. This has gotten us pretty far in like what we've been able to understand about the brain. But fundamentally, the brain, as we know, is nonlinear and also highly complex, especially on this temporal scale, as well as across the entire brain, looking at population, the entire population of the brain's neurons. And so for this, I think all of us at this workshop has been in somewhat of agreement that we need somewhat more expressive models. And in order to have these expressive models be somewhat useful, I think we need to definitely train it on a lot of data. So let's try to see how we can do this for IEG data. All right, so just to reiterate the point, especially for this kind of data and a lot of neural data sets, we need to train across subjects because there's just not enough data within a single subject to really train the model. So we're going to try to do this, and hopefully we'll have a model that, because it's been biased in the correct way by all these different subjects worth of data, we can actually use it for downstream fine-tuning for improved performance as well as improved sample efficiency. All right, so why can't we just do this? Well, there's a major challenge with this type of data. We have variable channel layouts and semantics. So this is one example of a patient's brain with the electrodes implanted. And this is another patient's brain with a different set of electrodes implanted. And if you were to collect a lot of patients, you could probably cover like most of the brain. But like the problem is you're going to have different channels in different locations. And this is a problem for most machine learning architectures because we kind of assume that, say, like with images, RGB is RGB, and you're not going to change that. But in this case, we're kind of changing it all the time. So it's kind of a big problem. We need to figure out a way to be able to put everything into the same latent space. And I think, as Yizi already mentioned earlier, one good way to do this is with transformers. So we're going to take a look at how we can do this for this problem specifically. Another challenge is that we also are working with high temporal resolution signals. Intracranial EEG has this very high fidelity benefit because we are recording from within the brain. So we're actually recording average responses of a bunch of neurons around the electrode. And so for this, we actually do want to maintain this resolution in order to be able to have sort of this sub-millisecond neural activity be captured. This means that a lot of the signals are recorded at more than 1,000 hertz sampling rate. Sometimes it goes up to 32,000 hertz if you really wanted to resolve these single neuron activities. But we might not have to go all the way up there right now, but at least 1,000 hertz is quite high compared to a lot of the current day foundation models, quote unquote, that people are building for these types of time series data. In addition to that, this also makes it really computationally expensive to train, right? Because you have so many time points as input from so many channels, more than hundreds of channels per subject, as well as multiple hours of these recordings per subject if you wanted to do self-supervised learning, and especially if you wanted to make this model useful, right? You want to train as much data as possible. One thing that we saw in a previous talk is that IEEG actually has a lot of data out there. And so if we wanted to scale, we want to scale this efficiently. And as you can see, IEEG at the very bottom has one of the most data that neural modalities have. And this is from Patrick's talk. So I found this really interesting. So hopefully we can really scale this much larger. Okay, just to reiterate, our goal is to train a foundation model of IEEG activity. We have a challenge of variable layouts, as well as computational cost. And the output that we want is useful representations of neural activity to help improve decoding performance, as well as improve sample efficiency. All right, so let's dive into our approach. How can we actually do this? Well, so you have a population of 3 channels, and we're recording from them. And we have these time series. We propose to use pre-trained temporal embedding models. So you can think of this as your time series foundation models that are nice, bright, and shiny nowadays, to be able to give us a token that represents this time series data. Now, this could be time series foundation models. This could be a specific one that you've trained on your IEEG data so that it is actually capturing more of the information that you want. This is somewhat analogous to, say, like creating a manually extracted feature set where you have, say, like the power band features, except in this case, it's learned across your data. So these temporal embeddings are frozen models working on univariate time series that you train across maybe your entire IEEG data set. So hopefully it can extract useful features just like power band features. All right, so we have these useful tokens that represent our time series. What we want to do is to refine the representations of these time series tokens to have representation information from its neighbors as well. So they can like take information from the context. And what we can do is with the transformer, we have self-attention. Attention is all you need, right? So this has been really useful for a lot of domains such as language and vision. And so we thought that this would also be very useful for this population level, especially because we really want to be able to look at the attention across different channels. Okay, so we do this for all the different tokens. We call this the population transformer. In addition to that, we have a classification token, sort of like in BERT, the language model that a lot of people still use embeddings from today. And so we can maybe hopefully see that this model could be sort of like BERT in providing these kinds of useful embedding spaces so that we can actually build off of in the future. Similarly, this class token also has these attention weights, and we're going to learn them in our pre-training task as well. Okay, so this is the general approach, just a tiny little sprinkle. We do need to have the 3D position of each of these electrodes as sort of positional encodings here. This really helps the model be able to contextualize where this time series is coming from. All right, so now you might be wondering, how do we actually pre-train this model? The pre-training tasks that we use try to improve individual channel representations, as well as improve the population ensemble representation. So this is the individual tokens for each channel, as well as the classification token that you saw earlier. All right, so for each of the individual channels, we're trying to ask the question, what does context tell us about this channel? And the way that we can set this up as a learning problem is that we have electrodes from the brain, say at time t, these orange ones. And then for some very small percentage of these orange ones, we randomly select them to be replaced with a different time point. And so what the model needs to do then is to be able to identify at each one of these output tokens, whether or not the token has been replaced with this time t prime token. So basically, was this channel swapped out? And you can kind of think of this as being quite helpful for the model to be able to refine representations, because it would need to be able to understand what makes sense for the brain to be as like a current moment, right? And if something is kind of off, then it should be able to identify that. The other task we have is for the ensemble-wise task, which is basically learning the population information at the class token. For this one, we have the class token as well as, again, the brain state at time t. And then this one's also inspired by BERT. where we have brain state at time t prime as sort of another input. And the goal here is for the classification token to guess whether or not the brain state at time t is close to t prime. This provides us a sort of clean or smooth sort of representation space of our neural data. Because if t prime is really far away, we would expect that it may not be like as close a representation as if they were like right next to each other. Okay, so those are the two pre-training tasks. Now for some data. We primarily focus on the intracranial EEG data. And this is a new data set that's just been released at NERVS 2024. It is a naturalistic movie watching data set where patients at the Boston Children's Hospital is watching movies. It's really easy to get children to watch movies, I guess. So this is a great way to scale data. And in addition to the actual movie, there's a lot of information about the transcripts as well as the relationship between words and transcripts in this data set. So if you're really interested in digging into language and how this can be structured in the brain, and you want a naturalistic task with a lot of data, this is a great one to dig into. It's called the Brain Tree Bank. It has 26 sessions, basically 26 movies, and 10 subjects. So this is the primary one that we focus on, but we're also kind of curious whether or not it works for like scalp EEG. So we also use the Temple University Hospital EEG data set, which is one of the largest data sets out there for clinical EEG. And it has about 14,000 subjects, which is mind-boggling. All right. So how can we actually evaluate whether or not like pre-training with this type of model even helps us? So we start with our pre-trained population transformer, and we want to put this linear decoder on there so that we can actually do downstream decoding. So that's our model. We're going to say ours. And then for the baselines, we might compare with this linear approach that I kind of touched on earlier, where you might concatenate all your band power features from all your channels together, and then input that into your linear layer to get your output task decoding. Say you wanted to make that nonlinear, sure, we can do that. Deep NN is that. And then we also wanted to make sure that it wasn't just the architecture that is giving us these benefits. And so we also compared with the randomly initialized population transformer architecture. So that's in orange. All right, so we're gonna take a look at some results. We have color-coded all the models, and this is across a bunch of tasks. So we first start on the left with some auditory tasks, basically decoding whether or not the pitch or volume was high or low that the person was listening to. In the middle, we have linguistic tasks for whether or not the person's listening to the start of a sentence or just some random noise. For speech versus non-speech, it's word versus some random noise. So is the brain processing language or not? Yes. And then finally, the EEG data set is sort of abnormal EEG detection. And we also see the same sort of pattern with the pre-trained population transformer, very vastly outperforming the other three baselines. And I think this could be due to the fact that we have very good representations of individual channels, not necessarily manually extracted features, and also for this like population level sort of pre-training. All right. In addition to that, we have some performance scaling with the number of channels. Generally, what we see with, say, the baseline approaches is that because you have limited amount of downstream decoding data, it's actually pretty hard to have good performance as you increase the number of channels. So what we see here is that the number of channels as we increase it in the x-axis, the baseline approaches sort of plateau pretty early, whereas the pre-trained population transformer continues to improve as we have more channels. And this is probably helpful just because of the pre-trainings. For sample efficiency, on the x-axis, we have, say, a subset of the fine-tuning samples in the downstream task. We go from as low as 50 samples all the way to 500. In the full data set, we have about 1,000 plus samples, and that's noted by the stars here. That's the full data set, if you were to train on the full data set. And I guess what we want to highlight here is that to achieve the baseline decoding performance from the baseline models, our pre-trained population transformer only requires about maybe 50 samples in the sentence onset case, which is a dramatic decrease in the number of samples you need compared to 1,000 plus. And we see similar things, but maybe like in the hundreds-ish range for the other tasks. All right, now that you've seen some nice results for why the pre-trained model is useful, we want to also see whether or not it will be useful for new subjects. So say your subject is not in the pre-training data set. We perform this hold one out sort of approach where we take the downstream decoding subject out of the pre-training set, pre-train on the rest of the subjects, and then evaluate on that held out subject. What we find is a minimal sort of decrease in the performance, which is very promising. So it is very possible to try to extrapolate this to new subjects. We compare this with the baseline of the non-pre-trained population transformer, which is fairly similar to the linear and dependent as well. Great, okay, so now we also want to make sure that our model is actually scaling. And so we also change the amount of data that is available in pre-training. And what we find is that as we increase the amount of pre-training data, the performance of these downstream decoding tasks also improve. So this is a good evidence that if we were to continue to increase the amount of data, we would also improve the performance here. And these tasks are not super difficult. So I would expect that if we have something that is with a higher ceiling, we could potentially see even more benefits with more training data. And yeah, there's just a lot more to explore because we've only worked with this one data set so far. All right, then not only can we get this interesting decoding performance, we can actually also begin to interpret this model because it is on the population level. So as for you to recall, we have the classification token, which is useful for downstream decoding. And this has attention weights going into it from all the input channels. In the language space, people have done this sort of analysis for sentences, and we find that there are interesting attention weights that go between certain words in the sentence that tell us that, okay, maybe it is actually referring to the animal. And this is like some interesting insights that we have been able to find from language models, and maybe we can also discover the same thing here in our brain regions for specific tasks. All right, so what we find is that attention weights highlight functional brain areas. And what we can do is we can plot all the attention weights onto the brain from where these electrodes come from relative to the classification token, which is used for each of these downstream tasks. And what we find is that the auditory and Wernicke areas are highlighted for a lot of these auditory and linguistic tasks with the black arrow. And then we also see a lot of other areas that are kind of highlighted as well. So it could be interesting as like sort of a hypothesis generation tool, maybe dig into what those features might look like for those brain areas specifically. All right, so in summary, we showed that we can scale across data sets with different sensor layouts and high resolution channels. We find boosts in performance even to held out subjects. And this has implications for BCI as well as neuroscientific study, especially with the potential for interpretability as well. There's a lot of interesting future work that we could test with this, with more diverse data training, as well as investigating the interpretability findings and potentially applying this to clinical applications where you might want to be able to decode these in sort of more real-time scenarios. So I want to thank all my collaborators. It's amazing working with everyone. Also thank the organizers for inviting me to give this talk. If you'd like, you can try out the model yourself. We have weights and code, as well as more of this. It's a website, so you can just kind of look at the results more if you want. So yeah, let me know if you have any questions.